1 year ago, a devastating conflict erupted between Israel and Hamas. The anniversary serves as a stark reminder of the ongoing violence. The conflict began with a surprise attack by Hamas. Israel responded swiftly, launching a counteroffensive. Both sides remain locked in a deadly cycle of violence. The past year has seen intense fighting and fragile ceasefires. Each ceasefire brings hope, only to be shattered by renewed hostilities. The conflict has exacted a heavy toll on both sides. The international community calls for restraint and peace. The path to peace remains elusive, casting a long shadow over the region. The true extent of the human tragedy unfolding in Gaza remains shrouded in uncertainty. The fog of war makes it difficult to obtain accurate casualty figures. Both sides provide conflicting accounts, and independent verification is often hampered by the chaotic conditions on the ground. The Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza has reported a staggering number of Palestinian casualties, including a significant number of civilians. Israel, while acknowledging civilian casualties, maintains that its operations are aimed at Hamas militants and infrastructure. It argues that Hamas deliberately uses civilians as human shields, making it extremely difficult to avoid collateral damage. The lack of clarity surrounding the casualty figures only adds to the anguish and despair of those affected by the conflict. It also fuels accusations and counter-accusations, further deepening the divide between the two sides. A comprehensive and impartial investigation is urgently needed to establish the facts and hold those responsible for violations of international law accountable. The Israel-Hamas conflict is marked by a series of key dates that have shaped the trajectory of the conflict. These dates serve as grim milestones in the ongoing cycle of violence. On October 7, 2022, Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel, marking the beginning of the current conflict. The attacks, which included rocket fire and ground incursions, caught Israel off guard and resulted in significant casualties. Israel responded swiftly with airstrikes and a ground offensive into Gaza, targeting Hamas military infrastructure and personnel. The conflict escalated rapidly, drawing in neighboring countries and prompting international condemnation. Several attempts at a ceasefire have been brokered, but none have held for long. Each ceasefire violation has led to a renewed cycle of violence, further dimming the prospects for a lasting peace. The key dates in the conflict serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of ceasefires and the urgent need for a political solution to address the underlying issues driving the conflict. The anniversary of the Hamas attacks on Israel has been met with heightened tensions and a surge in violence. The date serves as a painful reminder for both sides, inflaming passions and fueling the desire for revenge. In the days leading up to the anniversary, there were reports of increased rocket fire from Gaza into Israel. Israel responded with airstrikes targeting Hamas positions in Gaza. The anniversary itself saw a surge in protests and clashes along the Gaza border fence. Palestinian demonstrators burned tires and hurled stones at Israeli soldiers, who responded with tear gas and live ammunition. The escalation in violence on the anniversary highlights the deep-seated animosity and lack of trust between the two sides. It also underscores the challenges in breaking the cycle of violence and achieving a lasting peace. Section 5. A barrage of firepower military actions escalate. The conflict between Israel and Hamas is characterized by the overwhelming use of military force. Both sides have engaged in extensive military operations, resulting in widespread destruction and heavy casualties. Israel has deployed its advanced military capabilities, including fighter jets, helicopters, and tanks, in its operations against Hamas targets in Gaza. Hamas, for its part, has relied heavily on its arsenal of rockets, which it has fired indiscriminately into Israeli territory. While Hamas rockets lack the precision and firepower of Israel's weaponry, they have proven effective in sowing terror and disrupting daily life in Israel. The relentless barrage of rockets and airstrikes has turned populated areas into war zones. Civilian infrastructure, including homes, schools, and hospitals, has not been spared. The escalating military actions have only exacerbated the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, leaving the civilian population trapped in a deadly crossfire. Section 6. The human cost. A dire humanitarian crisis. The conflict has had a devastating impact on the civilian population in Gaza. The Gaza Strip, already suffering from years of blockade and economic hardship, is now facing a humanitarian catastrophe of immense proportions. The relentless bombardment has left thousands of Palestinians dead, many of them women and children. Hospitals are overwhelmed with casualties, and there is a critical shortage of medical supplies, clean water, and sanitation facilities. The destruction of infrastructure has further exacerbated the crisis, leaving many without access to basic necessities. The United Nations has warned of a looming humanitarian disaster if the fighting continues. International aid organizations are struggling to provide assistance to those in need, but their efforts are hampered by the ongoing violence and restrictions on access. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is a stark reminder of the human cost of this intractable conflict. Section 7. A World's Plea International calls for restraint. The international community has reacted with growing alarm to the escalating violence in the Middle East. Governments and international organizations have issued urgent calls for restraint and a ceasefire. The United Nations Security Council has held multiple emergency meetings to discuss the situation, but has been unable to agree on a joint statement due to divisions among its members. The United States, while expressing support for Israel's right to defend itself, has also called on all parties to de-escalate the violence and protect civilians. European leaders have urged both sides to show restraint and return to the negotiating table. The Arab League has condemned Israel's actions and called for an end to the siege of Gaza. International calls for a ceasefire have intensified, but a breakthrough remains elusive as both sides appear determined to continue fighting. Section 8. Beyond Gaza's borders. The threat of regional escalation. One of the most alarming aspects of the current conflict is the potential for it to spill over into neighboring countries, igniting a wider regional conflagration. The conflict has already inflamed tensions in the West Bank, where Palestinian protests have been met with a heavy-handed response from Israeli security forces. There are also growing concerns about the possibility of the conflict spreading to Lebanon, where the powerful Shiite militant group Hezbollah maintains a formidable arsenal of rockets and missiles. Hezbollah has engaged in several conflicts with Israel in the past and has vowed to support Hamas in the current conflict. Any escalation of violence involving Hezbollah could have far-reaching consequences, potentially dragging Israel into a multi-front war and further destabilizing the region. The risk of regional escalation is a stark reminder of the interconnectedness of conflicts in the Middle East and the potential for them to spiral out of control. Section 9. The specter of Lebanon, Hezbollah, enters the fray. The specter of a wider regional conflict looms large as Hezbollah, the powerful Shiite militant group based in Lebanon, has become increasingly vocal in its support for Hamas. Hezbollah has a long history of conflict with Israel and has vowed to retaliate against any Israeli attacks on Lebanon. In recent days, there have been reports of rocket fire from Lebanon into Israel, raising fears that Hezbollah may be preparing to directly enter the conflict. Israel has responded to the rocket fire with artillery strikes on southern Lebanon, further escalating tensions. The involvement of Hezbollah would mark a significant escalation of the conflict and could have catastrophic consequences for the region. Hezbollah's vast arsenal of rockets and missiles could inflict significant damage on Israeli cities and infrastructure. A wider war involving Hezbollah would also likely draw in other regional actors, further complicating efforts to achieve a ceasefire. Section 10. A stalemate persists. The challenges to peace. Despite international pressure and the mounting human cost, the conflict between Israel and Hamas remains mired in a deadly stalemate. Both sides appear entrenched in their positions, with neither willing to make the concessions necessary to reach a lasting peace. Israel insists that it will not negotiate with Hamas, which it considers a terrorist organization. It demands that Hamas disarm and recognize Israel's right to exist. Hamas, for its part, refuses to renounce violence or recognize Israel, which it views as an illegitimate state occupying Palestinian land. The lack of trust and the deep-seated animosity between the two sides make it extremely difficult to find common ground. Past attempts at negotiations have failed to bridge the divide, and the current climate of violence makes it even more challenging to restart the peace process. The lack of a political horizon and the absence of any viable alternatives to violence perpetuate the cycle of conflict and suffering. Hopes for a lasting resolution. As the conflict enters its second year, peace remains elusive. The international community must press for a ceasefire and negotiations. Addressing Jerusalem's status, Palestinian refugees, and Israeli settlements is crucial. Security concerns of both sides must be addressed. A two-state solution is essential for lasting peace. Tremendous political will and compromise are needed. The international community has a moral obligation to help end this conflict.